Yes, good afternoon. Today is, uh, oh boy, October the 22nd, and it is Thursday. Um, and today we are continuing our discussion of the successful and unsuccessful path to power, focusing on Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, actually. Today we're going to try and focus on two countries, Prussia, which, as you know, will eventually become Germany, and Russia, which will become Soviet Union and now Russia again. But anyway, so let's have a look and get started. Um, I will say this, that I don't know when you're going to receive this. You wait till Thursday or whatever. But from this point on, students who are in front of me during the course of the school year, I intend to lecture, to talk to. As opposed, you probably noticed that the first part of this course, I would just sit here and let the canned Horton do his business, and I decided I didn't like that. I think that I'm much more effective by standing up and inflecting my voice. And so, unless something happens, unless I'm just feeling terrible, um, I am going to try and come to you if you are here. And a week from today, a week from Thursday, the 29th of October, you will, most of you, be here. If you're not here, then you'll still continue to receive a steady diet of canned Horton, we call it. I think fresh Horton is better. So anyway, let us begin, shall we? First with Prussia. Prussia was ruled by another long-lasting family in Central Europe, the Hohenzollerns. Now, you might recall that on the next test, there will be a matching section, actually two matching sections, and in the smaller matching section only have 5 items, but those 5 items will be for you to match the ruling families of Europe with their country. Prussia, and later Germany, were ruled by a family called the Hohenzollerns. Yes, I know, difficult to pronounce. The Hohenzollerns did an admirable job of subjugating every noble under their central control, whereas, if you remember, Poland disappeared because it could never get the nobility to march in line. The Hohenzollerns, were able to unite the resources of the country into one goal, which was an army. It was, quoting Rick Steves now, it was often said of Prussia that as opposed to being a country with an army, Prussia was said to be an army with a country. Yeah. So, Prussia, though united politically, was disunited geographically. Let's see if we can bring that up, shall we? This. That's terrible. Come on. Okay. Now, yes, I'm sure you may have seen this before if you did the take-home test. But this, you see the black areas here, this is Prussia in the mid-17th century. And as you can see, while they may be united politically, in other words, there's one ruling family, the Hohenzollerns, that ruled Prussia. And by the way, this today is where Latvia is. But they're disunited geographically, and that presents its own set of problems from a ruling standpoint. You have to remember, they didn't have any kind of telecommunication. Their roads, they did have roads, but they were often, in the wintertime, roads in Europe would become muddy. No, the point of the matter is it was hard to administer over this far-flung country because it was so spread out. They had no methods of instant communication, no railroads or highways or anything of that nature. And so, yeah, it was a difficult task. And so, yes, this was Prussia in the mid 17th century. And as you can see, now you might be asking, now what's this black line here, Mr. Horton? Well, this is called Der Zollverein. Zollverein. You say, what's that? The Zollverein was Zoll means toll, Verein means free. It was an agreement amongst all the countries in here. And, from here on the Adriatic in what is now Italy to all the way up here, half of Poland is now here, deep into France. But there's an agreement amongst all these Germanic countries to not charge each other tariffs or tolls as goods passed from one province to another. Because all these areas in here, there were many different independent or semi-independent states. And to keep trading simple, they simply made this agreement not to charge each other tolls, and it was called Der Zollverein. Those of you who know German, Zoll means toll, Verein means free. So they didn't charge each other tolls, and that, for the most part, was the only unifying factor for much of Prussia until the 19th century. And so good. So you see one of the problems that Prussia has right off the bat. It is disunited politically. So, excuse me. Despite its size, it was second only in size to Austria in 1680. Prussia had weaknesses. One of them, of course, was the fact that it was scattered all over the place. It reminds me of when I'd walk in the pasture, you'd see cows dropping things, and that pretty much looked like what it was. The person responsible for largely what Prussia would become was Frederick William, who ruled from 1640 to 1688, called the Great Elector. Between 1655 and 1660, Sweden and Poland had engaged in a war that endangered Frederick William's holdings in Pomerania. Pomerania is over here. Yes, it's handy to have a map. So, Frederick William collected taxes both legally and illegally and raised an army to defend Prussian interests. An unintended effect of this was the rise of this is a test question if I ever saw one. And the word there is Junkers, not Junkers, Junkers. Don't make any remarks about my car. The Junkers were, as it says there, the landholding class of Prussia, who would rise to dominate the Army Officer Corps. Interesting point going forward. The Junkers, dominated the leadership of the Prussian, later German Officer Corps into the 20th century. In fact, this is trivia. This is something, that won't be on the test. But during World War II, it is not a secret that Adolf Hitler did not get along well with his staff of officers, army officers. And one of the reasons was quite simple, that all of the officers in the Wehrmacht were Junkers. Yes, they were Junkers. And what that means was that they were officers in the German army. Their fathers had been officers in the German army. Their grandfathers had been officers in the Prussian army. Their great-grandfathers were officers, etc., etc., etc. And here they were listening to an Austrian son of a paper hanger, which is what Adolf Hitler's father did. He hung wallpaper. Tell them how to conduct a war. And you can see why that it would cause friction. But the point of the matter is, these Junkers, the landowning class of Prussia, would rise to dominate. They would become a powerful group within Germany, and they will dominate the leadership of the Army Officer Corps. Frederick I, who ruled from 1688 to 1713, was the least Prussian of all the monarchs. He was a supporter of the arts who lived luxuriously, but because of his support of the Spanish in the War of Spanish Succession, he received the name the King of Prussia. After Frederick I's death in 1713, he was succeeded by Frederick William I. He imposed austere measures on the government to save money. He wanted to have an efficient and compliant bureaucracy and a larger, more efficient army. One of the stereotypes, and it's kind of worth noting that even today in Europe, the language most spoken around breakfast tables in Europe is not English, not Russian, it is German. Yeah, the Germans, there are a lot of Germans. They're the largest ethnic group in Europe. Now, they're divided amongst several countries today. Even today, Austria, remember, all Austrians are German. Swiss, the northern part of Switzerland is German. Liechtenstein, of course, Germany, but yeah. He established a cabinet-type government. Interested parties would send papers to the cabinet. William I would read them individually, and that way he skirted the influence of advisors and ministers and ruled alone. He organized the government into something called the General Oberfinanzkrieg und Directorium. I love German words, don't you? It's like they keep adding syllables. Actually, German is like, I know because I took 3 years of German college. It doesn't flow like French. Anyway, also called the General Directory. All right, so service to the state became impersonal, mechanical, and in effect unquestioning. Frederick William I built one of the most efficient armies in all of Europe. He organized a group called the Potsdam Guard. Now, the Potsdam Guard were an interesting crew. And I swear I've seen them on a test somewhere. I can't remember where. Yeah, the Potsdam Guard. Frederick William I had his army go out and recruit soldiers with the following characteristics. Tall, over 6 feet, which in the 18th and early 19th century, a person over 6 feet tall was not that common. You have to remember that the average height of Europeans has actually increased in the past 200 years. But back then, somebody over 6 feet tall was considered tall. And so these guys were over 6 feet tall. They had blonde hair and blue eyes. And if that sounds Aryan to you, no coincidence. It was thought of as the perfect Aryan German physical traits. This attracted the Junker nobility. Military values dominated the Prussian government. Military values like punctuality, like discipline, like lack of a sense of humor, like extreme organization. See, there are lots of different kinds of Germans. There are Bavarians, there are Badens, there are Austrians, there are Hanoverians, Hessians, etc., etc., etc. Silesians, but Prussians are the one most people think of when they think of like people who have no sense of humor, very punctual, very on time, very disciplined, very straightforward. Prussians. So, military values dominate the Prussian government, society, and daily life as no other state in Europe. Once again, Frederick William I built an army that had a country. Frederick William I had the greatest army in Europe and avoided using it. Remember that during the American Revolution, the British hired Prussian soldiers. Yeah, Prussians. Hessians, yeah, but Hessian province in Prussia. And he avoided using it. He passed that army on to his son, Frederick the Great, who would not have his father's restraint about using his army. Okay, now let's move from Prussia to Russia. Okay, now Russia is different from the rest of Europe. Why? Well, notice what it says. Russia was cut off from the rest of Europe linguistically. Now you say, what does that mean? Well, they spoke a different language. Well, yes, they did. But it was more than that. It wasn't just the language they spoke, it was the language they wrote. They wrote. You see, Russia uses an alphabet called the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, you guys have, some of you take German, some of you take French, some of you take Spanish, all of you take English, and guess what? All of those languages use the same alphabet. 26-letter Latin alphabet. Yeah, the Latin alphabet, same alphabet. Russian is not. Russian is in the Cyrillic alphabet, which has many more characters, many different characters. It was an alphabet founded by Saint Cyril, a Russian missionary who brought the Eastern Orthodox faith to Russia. It's called the Cyrillic alphabet, and it doesn't translate well into Western European languages. Yeah, Russian is one of the hardest languages in Europe, if not the hardest language in Europe to learn. The Slavic languages, there's no crossover. You know, I've learned German and I'm learning Spanish, and you can see a crossover between the two languages. English is a Germanic language. Spanish is a Romance Latin language, but I mean, you can see in French, you can see a crossover. With Russia, no. And so that fact cut and isolated Russia off from the rest of Europe religiously. Now, all the rest of Europe was either Roman Catholic or Protestant. Russia, on the other hand, was not. Russia was Eastern Orthodox, which was an entirely different faith. But the biggest thing separating Russia from the rest of Europe was geography. You say, well, how could that be? Well, for one thing, Russia had no seaports. Yeah, when Peter the Great took over Russia, Russians had one seaport. It was a place called Archangel. And Archangel is a seaport on the Arctic Ocean. The problem with Archangel is that 3 months out of the year, Archangel turns into a solid block of ice. Well, it used to. Now, not so much. But yeah, and that's the problem. For 3 months out of the year, the Russians had no access to the ocean. And so, yeah, they were cut off. There were no good roads. You have to remember that roads are something that have been built in much of the world over the last 100 years. And I'm talking about even dirt roads. They were built over the last 100 years. Well, we're talking about Russia in the 18th century. They had roads, but they would become impassable during bad weather. And the roads weren't very good. And you're also talking about running up and down these roads on horse-drawn carriages if you were lucky enough to have that. If not, you were walking. Point of the matter is, so Russia was isolated from the rest of Europe. So, but let's go back in history. Russia was cut off from the rest of Europe linguistically, religiously, and geographically, and did not enter most European exchanges, nor did it trade, things of that nature. The Russians, exchanges of knowledge. Russia had no age of science, for example, no enlightenment, for example, which we'll study about in the future. But yeah, Russia didn't go through those things until the arrival of this guy, Peter the Great. But before we talk about Peter the Great, let's go back in Russian history. Russia, historically, has the most colorful rulers in all of Europe. And colorful does not necessarily mean good, brilliant, does not mean, efficient, does not mean anything like that. Colorful means out there, you know. Colorful means, crazy. A significant number of the Russian monarchs, being the product of inbreeding, had mental issues, uncontrollable rage, for example. Um, Peter the Third who was great grandson of Peter the Great, liked to dress up in soldiers and liked to spank people, and he liked to dress up mice as soldiers. But we'll talk about Peter the Third a little later on. Let's talk about Peter the First before that. So after Ivan the Terrible, and Ivan the Terrible, he was a real interesting character. Ivan the Terrible. Um, there was an Ivan the Great, an Ivan the Terrible, but Ivan the Terrible, he had a strange childhood. When Ivan the Terrible was a child, he would amuse himself by tossing dogs and cats off the high roof of the Kremlin and watching them, ooh, splat. Of course, those of you who have done some reading know that people who spend a part of their childhood abusing animals often turn out to be serial killers. Ivan the Terrible had no compunctions about killing people. He once had an entire town exterminated because they weren't loyal to him or something like that. He got so angry at his own son at one point in time, I'm talking about Ivan the Terrible here, that he picked up his rod, which had an iron tip, struck the boy in the head, and killed him. Yeah. But after Ivan the Terrible, Russia had no real strong rulers for a time and entered a time known as the Time of Troubles. In 1613, the nobles elected a 17-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov. And by the way, that's the last dynasty, the Romanovs. So let's see. England, the Hanovers, France, the Bourbons, Austria, the Habsburgs, Prussia, the Hohenzollerns, and now Russia, the Romanovs. Okay? Elected a 17-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov, who would become the first of the Romanov family of rulers. Mikhail and his two successors, Alexis I and Theodore III, brought stability and modest governmental progress to Russia. Much of the country, however, remained impoverished and weak and was ruled by a group called the Boyars. On your test, the Boyars, the old nobility of Russia. And this government could barely survive revolts of the peasants and a group of cavalry called Cossacks, or an uprising from the palace guards known as the Strautsky. Now, Theodore III died and left two new young rulers, Peter and his sickly older brother named Ivan V. Let's first look at her. Now, this woman, her name was Sophia Romanov. Sophia Romanov, and yeah, get a good look at that face. Remember, she posed for, it's not a photograph. She posed for that picture. Not sure how well she would do on Match.com with that. But the point of the matter, she wanted to look like that because she had it set in her mind that she was going to be the next Tsarina of Russia. But she wasn't next in line. The next in line were her two nephews, Peter the First and Ivan the Fifth. Ivan the Fifth being the older one, but Ivan the Fifth was mentally challenged and sickly to begin with. And so, what they decided to do, they allowed Peter and his older brother Ivan to rule jointly for a while. Ivan then died in 1696, and Peter became the Tsar. A young Tsar became certain of two things. Number one, that the office of the Tsar must become secure from both the boyars, the nobility, and the Strotsky, the palace guard. The palace guards were just as dangerous to a young Tsar as was the any other enemies he might have. The Strotsky were really kind of like the old Praetorian Guard in Rome. Speaking of which, remember that the word czar, actually spelled several ways in English because it's the translation from Cyrillic to the Latin alphabet doesn't always work. It's often spelled TSAR, often spelled CZAR or CSAR. The word is czar, but where did it come from? The word czar comes from Caesar. Remember that in the ancient Roman Empire, that the ruler of the empire had the title of Caesar. Well, the Russian Romanovs, the Russians felt that they were the inheritors of the Roman Empire. They were the new Rome, and therefore their monarch would be named Caesar. The problem is, though, Russians have a difficult time pronouncing the double S sound, as in buzzer or geezer or Caesar. It comes out Tsar. And so, yeah, the Russian ruler became known as the Tsar. And so, yeah. So, Peter became certain of two things. Number one, like it says there, that he must gain dominance over the nobility and to the Strotsky. The Strotsky could not be trusted. That military, especially naval power in Russia, must be increased. Now, here's one of the things that Peter the Great did that was really, really, really amazing. Now, Peter the Great stood about 6'8" tall. He was a giant by standards of the day, just a giant of a man. And as a giant of a man, Peter the Great was able to sneak himself into Western Europe. Yeah. What it was, Peter the Great decided that he wanted to see how Western Europe did what it did. Why, he asked, were these small countries in Western Europe so much more wealthy, so much more advanced than the Russians? How could Russia compete with that? And so Peter the Great said, I'm going to go and find out what they're doing. I'm going to learn how to build a ship, for example, which he did. He disguised himself, went on a tour of Europe. One of the things he did was that he disguised himself as a carpenter, bought his own set of tools, and hired on a shipbuilding project, and even had his own ship built called the Peter and Paul. But yeah, he learned that from the Dutch. He knew that the Dutch had a trading fleet that was the envy of all Europe, so he learned how to do that. He learned about the military from Prussians. He went to London, where it was, some have said that when in London he met Sir Isaac Newton. He went to the London Observatory. While in London, it is worth mentioning that Peter and his entourage rented out a very, very nice house and pretty much trashed it. Yeah, I mean, defecating in the corners and things like that is, yeah, drinking way too much. However, he loved shipyards. Peter made it his goal to control the Strotsky, the boyars, to build a modern army and navy, and to control the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, here's the thing. When Peter the Great was a success, and at many of these things, but Peter the Great, he was, I don't want to use the term man's man, but he was very much into being a male, very much into, uh, you know, uh, being a military mind. For example, when Peter the Great was a child, he used to play war games. And in his war games, he used other children about his age, and they built forts and they fought battles. And these battles they fought with real artillery, real guns, and kids died in them. But Peter the Great wanted to see how things worked. He built like I said, fortress. He built a ship on a Russian lake to see how that worked. But yeah, but anyway, at one point during his trip, this trip he's taken to scout out Europe, he gets a message that back in the Kremlin, back in the castle, there's been a mutiny. And the centerpiece of the mutiny is his own son, Alexei Romanov. Now, Peter the Great was, he was all about being a ruler, all about being a tough guy. Alexei was like, wanted none of that. And in fact, Alexei didn't like his father, they didn't get along. When Alexei was a younger person, there was a plot that emanated somewhere in the Kremlin, a plot against Peter. Uh, Alexei and his friends were kind of involved. And what Peter did to teach Alexei was that he had all his friends who were co-conspirators rounded up. They went outside, and there was a series of wooden stumps. And Peter the Great, and Alexei was really squeamish. Peter the Great takes his son by the scruff of the shirt, drags him with him, and goes over to each of his friends who are tied with their hands behind their back and bent over the stump. And remember, Peter the Great has hands like this. In one hand, he has little Alexei, the teenage boy. In the other hand, he has an axe. And of course, Alexei was turning away, screaming. Peter picked up Alexei with his hand and shook him until he would look, and with the other hand, he would cut off his friend's head. He did that to all of his friends. The point of the matter being that relations between Peter the Great and little Alexei, who became young Alexei, not very good, as you can imagine. And so when he gets back, he finds that one of the conspirators was Alexei. And he grabs Alexei again, and this time says, "All right, buddy, you're going to first deny your inheritance. You're not going to be the next czar. And secondly, you're going to name names. Who was involved in this?" Alexei held out for about 3 days, and I'm talking about 3 days of torture. And in the end, he never did confess. He actually died of the torture. Peter the Great had his own son, tortured to death. But another thing that happened, Peter the Great had learned a great deal from this trip, and notice what it says there. He began by personally cutting off the beards and the long robes of the boyars that had made them a European joke. You see, by this time in Europe, men wore pants, knee breeches anyway, but pants. Russian men wore robes still, long robes, no pants underneath there. They wore these long robes, which of course could be rather cumbersome. And of course, the other thing was that according to Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox tradition, that for a man to cut his beard was considered a mortal sin. And you do know what a mortal sin is, right? Mortal sin? a sin from which there is no forgiveness, a sin that sends you straight to hell. But Peter said, I don't care. That light commits a mortal sin. Anyway, Peter said, I don't care. And he went around, grabbed the beards, and personally cut off the beards of many of the nobility. He also published a table of ranks. Privileged. Did I misspell that? How do you spell privilege? And there it is. This table of ranks, which instead of nobles just being entitled to, to rank and privilege, their rank became tied to their willingness to serve the state, aka Peter. Okay. Unlike the Prussian Junkers, Russian nobility had never become perfectly loyal to the central government. Peter had the rebellious Strotsky publicly executed and their bodies put on display outside the Kremlin. Peter also had the old hierarchy of the church removed and placed a layman called a procurator general to rule the church within the secular demands of Peter's government. Peter recreated institutions like he'd seen in Sweden, called colleges, which were like advisory boards, like councils instead of individual ministers. Peter encouraged economic growth. One thing that's not mentioned here, Peter brought with him back to Russia, and you're writing, yes. Okay. Oh, yeah. Peter encouraged economic growth. He encouraged the growth of the iron industry in the Ural Mountains, and the Ural Mountains still to this day are an important source of iron around the world. And yes, he brought the potato, and the potato can't overemphasize the importance of the potato in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, because the potato grew really well in the acidic soils of Eastern Europe, the rainy soils of Poland and Eastern Europe. And not only that, the potato could produce a lot more calories than a field of wheat with a lot less trouble. And so the potato began to take over Russia. Vodka, yeah. His changes achieved only marginal and temporary success, though by mid-century, Russia was the largest iron producer in Europe. Okay. His success was in developing a military, especially a navy. But, once again, Peter had the problem that if you look at a map of Russia, when Peter took over, Russia only had the one seaport, and that was to the north in Archangel, a seaport that froze 3 months out of the year. And so building a navy really didn't help. But what he will do, he will engage in 1720 in a series of wars with Charles XII, the purpose of which is to establish a seaport on the Baltic Sea, what Peter called windows of Europe, a warm water seaport. Now, let's write something here so that we will remember it. Yeah. I quote. That is a quote. The Russian bear is always thirsty for warm water, meaning that Russia was and still is very interested in gaining seaports that can be open 12 months out of the year. I mean, it was only 2 years ago that Russia just took the Crimea back away from the Ukraine. So, in about 1720, his navy was larger than that of either Sweden or Denmark. his armies battled Sweden and the Ottoman Empire. And against Sweden, Peter the Great was matched against Charles XII. And Charles XII was the young, very ambitious 17-year-old ruler of Sweden who actually was a young Napoleon. He was a very good ruler. And when the armies meet at the Battle of Narva, Narva, Charles XII actually gets the better of Peter. But Peter retreats back to Russia, and as he retreats, what he does, and you want to make note of this, what he does is that Peter the Great, as he gives ground to Charles XII's army, does what the Russians will do later on in World War II, and that is the Russians set fire to everything. They also did it to Napoleon, by the way. Scorched earth. Peter the Great used the size of Russia against his enemies. And that size, meaning that the enemy would have to cross a large expanse of territory, and by burning everything that the enemy could use, they would have to cross without supplies. And so, yeah. Now, Peter then regrouped, and in the second round between Charles and Peter, Peter won. And because of that victory over Charles XII in the Great North, this is called the Great Northern War, Peter won a sliver of land that opened up on the Baltic Sea, which we'll talk about. He'll make it into a city. Okay. He captured the port of Azov, which is on the Black Sea, but had to give it back in 1711. As says there, he lost it to King Charles XII, but then was able to recover it and defeat him in the Great Northern War. That gained territory for Russia. It gave Russia the provinces of Estonia, Livonia, and part of Finland. Peter was ruthless in establishing this army. He conscripted. The word conscripted, we know what it means. Do we know what it means? Do we know what it means? The draft. He drafted. The army's discipline was very harsh. The army had 300,000 men, except for the 1720s, though. Russia was involved in every foreign war every other decade in this century. All right. Oh my, are we finished? Maybe we are. Peter built the city of St. Petersburg as his new capital. Now, St. Petersburg, I need a better map. St. Petersburg is it's on a small seaport into the Baltic Sea, and it sits on a marsh. That was the problem. So Peter decides to build this city, which of course he names after himself, St. Petersburg. The spot he picks out is a marsh. And so he forces Russian peasants to come and work on it. It was said that St. Petersburg was built on mud and bones, because they had to drag in rock to build foundations for all these homes, for all these seaports. They had to bring in stone from far away. And they also had to move a lot of mud, drain a lot of swamps. The problem with that is that, by the way, 25,000 people died building St. Petersburg for Peter. Problem is, though, when you work in a marshy area, particularly that far north, in the summertime, you have mosquitoes that can carry you off, and they have diseases. In the wintertime, you're wet and cold, and there's this thing called exposure. And so, 25,000 Russians died in building St. Petersburg. He built the city like a European city, not a Russian one. He copied Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles as many ways as he could. As it says there, he built it on a boggy swamp, and 25,000 people died in its construction. Many Russians hated the city, but Peter required all members of the Russian nobility to construct a house in St. Petersburg. They could keep their old house wherever it was, but they also had to build a house in St. Petersburg. And many Russians hated the city of St. Petersburg because it was built like a Western European city and not like a Russian city. Peter had his own son, Alexis, in prison, and he later died in custody. He had been involved in many, Alexei had been involved in many plots against the rule of his father, and that left Peter without an heir. So for 30 years after, the leadership of Russia was in doubt. Peter left Russia more modern, but not so stable. The next great ruler of Russia will be not even Russian, Catherine the Great, who was a German princess. But look at that. We are finished. And let's see, today is the 20th. We can squeeze in a test, can't we? One more test. I mean, I've got the test made. So I will announce that, yes. Today is Thursday. We can do it Monday. I mean, but you got to have it done. Let's talk about it. Talk about it later, okay? Bye for now. I'll be sending you out your new study guide to the next unit, as well as your new terms. See you. Goodbye.